Can't decide and torn between a romantic, comedy, action, or an indie film to watch for the weekend? Well. Golden State Media Concepts Movie Podcast is your ultimate guide to the latest movies. Join us as we dissect the latest on the blockbusters. It's the Golden State Media Concepts Movie Podcast.
GSMC Movie Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I'm your host, Rich McDonough, and this episode should be coming to you March 22nd, and there's a lot going on in the film industry relative to major films coming out. The most notable cinematic event that happened recently is the release of the Snyder Cut from HBO Max, where original director Zack Snyder was able to go back and present to audiences his original vision for the Justice League. Having seen it, I can say it is an improvement on the one that came out in 2017, but I will say, if you're interested in watching it, definitely set aside a large portion of your day because it is legitimately 4 hours long. And for those of you familiar with Zack Snyder's work, know that he is a big fan of slow-mo, so maybe if he didn't use that effect so much, it would move along a little quicker. But definitely check it out if you were disappointed in the original or just looking for a big action-packed movie. But in terms of today's episode, I wanted to talk about the film Phobias, the new horror movie about a group of patients that are being treated for their extreme fears. Only thing is, the doctor that is caring for them is only doing so in an attempt to weaponize that fear. Afterwards, I want to talk about the film Exodus, which is set in a post-apocalyptic world, and the main character is in search of a door that will apparently lead to paradise. And the final film I wanted to get into today is The Vault, which is the new heist film set for release later this month, where a group of bank robbers take it as a personal challenge to see whether or not they can break into a vault within the Bank of Spain. And in my final segment, because of all the award talk and talk of who is the best director of the year, I wanted to take a look at some of the directors in Hollywood that are cranking out the best work on a consistent basis. So I will be giving my opinion on directors where if you see their name attached to a film, it is definitely worth your time and investing in. So be sure to stick around till the end of the show for that. But to kick off the show, I want to continue with this new feature where I introduce a film from the book 1001 Movies to See Before You Die, where I take a look at a piece of classic cinema and make my recommendation on whether or not you should see it before you die. And here's a quick spoiler, most of them are worth seeing before you die. But this week's recommendation is the 1973 film Serpico, starring Al Pacino, where he plays a cop that refuses to coalesce with the rampant corruption in the New York City police departments at the time, including such behaviors as refusing to take bribes. And while the idea of an authority figure fighting corruption seems fairly commonplace and seems to be played out in almost every procedural crime drama on TV there is, back in 1973, this was fairly revolutionary, and this film was based off the true story of real-life cop Peter Mace, who did ultimately testify in a case of police corruption. So, while it's a movie, the stakes that you're seeing played out were real. Not to mention that this was when Al Pacino was turning out some of his all-time greatest performances, and Serpico was the film where he garnered his first Academy Award nomination for Best Leading Actor. Now, if only he hadn't boycotted them the year previous for being nominated for Best Supporting Actor for The Godfather instead of Best Leading Actor, he probably would have won one earlier than 1992. But whatever, he doesn't need a tiny golden man to know that he's probably the best actor of his generation. But wrapping up, if anyone's looking for a classic film to watch, I recommend the crime thriller Serpico. But now that we've talked about cinema's past a little bit, I want to talk about a new release that's coming out, and that is the movie Phobias, which focuses on a group of people that have, you guessed it, phobias, which, as everybody knows, is the irrational fear of something. And these 5 patients that have these phobias are being cared for in a government facility where they're under the care of a doctor who is not only, let's call it, attempting to care for them, but he's really trying to harness their fear and turn it into a weapon. So, the plot of this film is essentially there's a government facility out there where the government is attempting to turn fear into a weapon to control the population. And for those conspiracy theorists listening to the podcast right now and telling me, of course, they're already doing that, I very much advise you to seek help. There are so many online therapy tools at this point, and if one of them wants to throw me a sponsorship, that would be great. But while I don't believe that there are government facilities out there literally harvesting fear from people, I do think that the government uses fear tactics fairly often to influence the population and get a desired result. And I don't think that's something that's unique to the US government. I think that's really just something any governing body does when they're trying to get a desired reaction out of the populace they're governing. But this whole idea of harnessing fear and using it as essentially a controlled substance where you're able to release it onto a population to drive them towards a certain conclusion is a fairly interesting one. The very famous words from Franklin Delano Roosevelt, "We have nothing to fear but fear itself." What if fear simply is itself? It's a controlled substance that can be manipulated and spread at will. And from a biological standpoint, fear is controlled through the amygdala, which is a part of the brain. So essentially, they're making some sort of formula that involuntarily triggers something in your brain that makes you feel the emotion of fear. And when it comes down to it, if there was such a way to harness fear as a weapon, I don't think there would be anything more devastating in any type of warfare. Soldiers can be trained to block out fear from certain things, like when it comes to being in a battle, they can be desensitized to gunfire and all that. But if you're harnessing just the very biological, involuntary fear response, you're essentially crippling a person within their own mind. And fear by itself as an entity, I think, is one of the most threatening things there can be. And it's going to be interesting to see how the movie Phobia essentially has fear as the big bad monster. This isn't going to be a horror movie like Friday the 13th or Nightmare on Elm Street where there's a physical incarnation that's trying to kill you. Phobias seems like it's going to be a really psychologically based thriller. And I'm sure like all horror films, there will be jump scares and it's going to be incredibly dimly lit so as to create the dark and mysterious environment that most horror films thrive in. So it'll have all the traditional trimmings of a horror film. And this whole idea of having the authority figure as the villain, it's not anything new by any means, especially in a medical setting. Nurse Ratched from One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest seems to jump to mind immediately. But this trend seems to have made a major comeback where the person in charge is the one that's corrupt and the one that shouldn't be trusted. And that idea in movies may just be in response to the growing number of people who think that establishments and different long-enduring institutions are corrupt at this point. Now, this movie, Phobias, is an extreme dramatization of that. God willing, there is no government facility out there where medical professionals are experimenting on people with mental illnesses. But to truly understand the message of the film, you have to take a look at what is happening beyond what is on screen and take a look at the subtext of what is happening. These 5 patients that are being experimented on come from modest means and are suffering from severe mental illnesses. And because of this, they are selected for some sort of government program where they're going to tap into that mental illness and find a way to weaponize it. Now, I personally am not a subscriber to the conspiracy theories about how the medical institutions in this country are great for one segment of the population and are essentially using the other segment of the population as guinea pigs. I don't believe that this COVID vaccine is a way for Bill Gates to implant microchips in all of us. But unfortunately, for some reason, there are people out there that believe those ridiculous things that I just said are a reality. There are people that don't believe in vaccinations. And there are people that have gone so far as to say that COVID-19 is cooked up by the government in order to make the population more compliant. Now, I don't see the logic in causing a worldwide recession to accomplish that feat, but there are people out there that accept it as fact. And I do apologize, I didn't intend for this to turn into a conspiracy theory session. But the premise of this movie, Phobias, where the government is testing on people with extreme fear of something in order to weaponize it, does get me wondering about the real-life conspiracy theories out there that people believe in, that the government is trying to make us more compliant, which all in all I feel is hogwash, given that America in particular was founded on the idea of preserving the rights of the individual over the rights of the government. But it's fun to think about for a film like Phobias that's taking you on a ride, and not only exploring what the concept of fear being used as a weapon would be like, just being under the control of someone else and not being able to exercise your own freedoms. And I am curious to see what this film will say about people with phobias, and just that mental illness in general, when people have these irrational fears to the point where it kind of paralyzes them from doing anything while that influence is present in their life. We are living in an age where mental illness is much better understood, and therefore more treatable, but it is a relatively infantile science. And I'm sure no one's going to a film for 100% medical accuracy, but just what they have to say about phobias in general, what causes them, the different effects it has on different people, and the possible methods of treatment will be pretty interesting to hear. I'm sure that that's not going to be the main focus of the film, because it really seems like this mad scientist character is going to be the main villain. And I doubt the film will have airtight logic as to why he's conducting the experiments he's conducting. And one of the most interesting aspects of this film is the fact that there are 5 directors, and each director is responsible for a different segment of the film, which is broken up by a specific type of fear. One segment is directed by Camila Bella, who actually was the main character of the 2006 film When a Stranger Calls, so she's no novice when it comes to horror. She directs a segment about hoplophobia, which is the fear of weapons and more specifically firearms, which is a pretty common fear. And I wonder if the phobias that they've decided to focus on in this film are the most common phobias out there. For instance, another phobia they choose to focus on in this film is vehophobia, which is the fear of driving. And that segment is directed by Marita Go. So we have fear of weapons, fear of driving. Another segment in the film is on robophobia, which is exactly what it sounds like, the fear of robots, as well as artificial intelligence. Which, if that is not one of the most common phobias out there, it is definitely one that's growing, just the dependence people are having on machinery and technology in general. So it is easy to see why that is one of the phobias being covered in this film, and that segment is directed by Joe Sill. And another phobia that it's pretty easy to see why they're covering it in this film is a telephobia, which is simply the fear of doing something incorrectly or doing it wrong. And given the level of perfectionism there is in contemporary society, I can definitely see why that would be a growing phobia and why more and more people are experiencing symptoms related to it. And that section is directed by Jess Varley. And I'm not only interested to see what happens in that specific segment, but I'm interested to just see what they say about the phobia as a whole. And in the final section of this film, directed by Chris von Hoffman, the phobia they tackle is aphobophobia, which is the fear of the youth. So essentially, this fear is just somebody who is afraid of the young people. I don't know if that's going to be used for a metaphor of change somehow, or if it's literally you're afraid of anybody younger than you. But seeing how they portray that on screen will be fun to see. And it will also be fun to see the pretty terrific cast in this film and see what they do with the source material. One of the main cast members is Leonardo Nam, who played Lutz in Westworld. Also in the film is former Pitch Perfect star Alexis Knapp, and another former cast member of Pitch Perfect is Hannah Mae Lee, who will be playing Sammy in this film. Other notable cast members include Lauren Miller Rogen, who is the wife of Seth Rogen, and Charlotte McKinney, who is best known for her roles in Fantasy Island and the Baywatch movie. So, a good cast with a compelling plot makes Phobias a film worth checking out. And once again, this film is available starting March 19th in limited theaters, as well as through video on demand. So be sure to check it out. Right now, however, we're going to take a small break on the GSMC movie podcast, but be sure to stick around, as coming up we will be talking about the new film Exodus, set in a post-apocalyptic society where the main character has to find his way to a doorway that will lead him to paradise, quote-unquote. And be sure to stick around until the end of the show, as I'm going to be getting into the best directors currently working in Hollywood right now. So don't go anywhere. We will be right back on the GSMC Movie Podcast.
Want to know the latest and hottest music hitting the airwaves? Don't be left out. Listen to the Golden State Media Concepts Music Podcast. It keeps you on the loop with everything you need to know from pop, rock, hip-hop, and the top 40. And we'll throw in news of your favorite artists, concert and tour dates, and so much more. Listen no further, because this is the gold standard in music podcast.
GSMC Movie Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I'm your host, Rich McDonough, and we just finished talking about the movie Phobias, the new horror film with several medical patients that have major phobias and a doctor who is caring for them in an attempt to weaponize fear. The film will premiere March 19th, both in limited theaters as well as video on demand, so by the time you're listening to this podcast, you will be able to check it out. So if you're a fan of the mind-bending horror flick, Phobias may be the one for you. And for all of you listening to the show right now, be sure to stick around until the very end, because right now, with all the awards ceremonies and talk of who's the best director of the year, it has me wondering who are the best directors going in Hollywood today. So that's what I'll be taking a look at. So if you are interested in hearing about the individuals who consistently are turning out the best work, be sure to stick around until the end of the show. But right now in the show, I would like to shift gears into the sci-fi fantasy film Exodus, which will also be available starting March 19th. And this film is set in a post-apocalyptic society. And that is pretty much all that's been revealed about this film so far. They seem to be looking for some sort of mystical door that acts to a portal to paradise, and they found out about this portal to paradise via a VHS tape. And for those younger listeners out there who don't know what a VHS tape is, it's essentially what people used to stream movies and TV shows on, only they were physical. And they took up a whole lot of space. But it is good to know that there is a VHS tape that survives the apocalypse and has all the information you need to make it to paradise on it. I do sort of miss VHS tapes, to be honest, especially when it was like, I don't know, something from Disney or Nickelodeon where the tape itself was actually a different color, and it just made it feel like the ultimate form of entertainment. I wonder what videos I would uncover if I were to go digging through my parents' basement. But getting back to the film, the videotape they have uncovered is going to lead them out of this apocalyptic heckhole into some sort of paradise. And for those of you who like going into a movie completely fresh, having really no idea about what the plot is going to be, there is not much out there in terms of plot about this movie. There's no explanation as to why this world is in an apocalyptic state, what the existence of this door to paradise really stands for or means. And the only real plot point we're given is the young protagonist Connor is trying to leave his desolate hometown behind in pursuit of finding this door. So I guess you could call the film Exodus an indie darling, where there's not much press about the film, or really that much about what the film is about, other than the brief synopsis that I've given. And I, for one, am kind of a fan of that. I mean, everything now seems to be spoiled to the point where if you watch the trailer, you pretty much know all the major moments of the film that are going to happen. And even if the major moments are withheld from the trailer, just from the information they give you in the trailer, you can pretty much piece together the plot and work out what the film is going to be about. But again, with this film Exodus, from the few plot points I know, I have no idea what's going to happen. They're in a post-apocalyptic world. How did we get to this post-apocalyptic world? The main character is in the pursuit of a door that is apparently the gateway to happiness, or paradise. What does that mean, and what is this paradise? So the fact that Exodus has pretty much left the plot of its movie a mystery, I think is really compelling. And it's really a shame that Hollywood's gotten to the point where they need to essentially give away the entire plot of their movie so they can rope audiences in. And it's hard to blame them because they're just reacting to trends that the audience exhibits. Nowadays, people aren't really willing to just roll the dice on going to see a movie. They want to make sure that it's going to check off all their boxes in terms of what they're looking for in a film, or that it has an actor that is a major box office draw, but we're seeing fewer and fewer of those as time goes on. Or the film needs to be part of an interwoven, connected franchise or cinematic universe to get people excited to go to the theater. I do hope, however, with the amount of streaming platforms out there, the amount of media companies out there, and just the sheer demand of content nowadays, that there are going to be more films like this where the story is a bit of a mystery. The cast is largely made up of either relative unknowns or complete newcomers, which most of the people in this cast are, and I will get to them later on. But in this new media landscape, I really hope there are opportunities for independent, standalone films to be made, and hopefully that starts shifting the trends of how studios promote movies and how audiences consume them. Hopefully it's not going to be either franchise or bust when it comes to going to see a movie, and there will be room for more of these standalone flicks. And hopefully a film like Exodus can be part of that movement and restore Hollywood to making individual films that appeal to a wide spectrum of audiences. But back to the topic at hand, which is the film Exodus. What I can say about it is the cinematography looks amazing. There is this kind of hue, I'll call it, and it seems as though that's to illustrate the fact that this is a sort of desolate wasteland of a society. And another thing about how this film appears to be shot, there seem to be a lot of scenes in darkness where the characters are shrouded, a lot of scenes taking place at night, which I'm sure in some way is supposed to illustrate the fact that they are in a depressed situation. And to contrast that, how in so many of these scenes there seems to be only one source of light, which, again, to throw on my amateur movie analyst hat, I would say that that is illustrating the fact that they are in this depressed world and they have one beacon of hope, which is finding this door, which is their only opportunity at salvation, really. And I'm sure there are a lot of people out there that can relate to the theme of the film Exodus, given that we're in a global pandemic. Tacked on top of that is a global recession, and I won't go as far to say we're living in a post-apocalyptic world, but the general population of the Earth is certainly looking for some sort of salvation, whether that's everyone being vaccinated or simply a return to normalcy. So there are a lot of major parallels between the film Exodus and what the world is dealing with as a whole. But the director, Logan Stone, who looks like a very young dude, he doesn't even look like he's in his 30s yet, so it's all the more impressive he has a feature-length film out. He clarified in an interview that the door itself essentially just means, or more so that the symbolism of the door is that people have a goals that they need to achieve or want to achieve, and they spend so much effort chasing it and pursuing it, so he thought the best way to make a physical representation of chasing and achieving your goals would be a door to paradise. And he spoke further on how he shaped his characters to be essentially caricatures of how people go about achieving their goals and the many different ways there are to do that. For instance, there are some characters that thoughtfully plot out their journey to their goals. There are some people that are opportunists and just take advantage of whatever situation they're in, and that there are people that kind of sabotage themselves in achieving their goal, where there's a character who says it's not even worth pursuing the door. So it's cool that he's taken this concept of chasing your goals and how different people go about pursuing their goals, and is telling that story through this Road Warrior-esque movie where there's essentially a barren wasteland, and it's up to you to navigate through that. And there are so many parallels in this movie that you can draw from what's going on in the world right now, but one thing the director really wanted to hammer home is the fact that there are some people that believe the door is real and it can be found, and there are some people that think it's a fantasy and it's not even worth pursuing. And he phrases it as there are these two groups on either side of a line, and neither side is willing to compromise or meet in the middle when it comes to their beliefs. And I wonder where he could have gotten that plot device from. But that is one of the great things about movies. They can take serious elements from the real world and put them into a digestible, entertaining forum. And from not knowing anything about Exodus before doing research for this podcast, I'm pretty intrigued to check it out and see what choices the director Logan Stone made and what he portrays on film. But since I've spent so much time talking about the what and the why of the film, I think it's only fair to talk about the who. And of course, by that, I'm talking about the cast. And just to preface this, I'm not really familiar with any of the actors in it, so this will be a fun exercise in discovering some new Hollywood faces. And first up, in the lead role of Connor, we have Jimmy Stanton, who has been in a couple major things to date. He was in the Tom Hanks film Greyhound, which has just been nominated for a couple Academy Awards. He was also in the Netflix series The Punisher, where he played a character simply known as Todd. And most recently, he has been in the Bryan Cranston show Your Honor, where he plays Carlo Baxter. So it'll be interesting to see if this is a star-making performance for Jimmy Stanton. Next up on the casting list, we have Janelle Snow, who plays Emissary, and she's probably best known for her role on Chicago Med, where she plays Dr. Audrey Lee. So another example of how the cast of Exodus is largely made up of unknown and up-and-coming actors. And continuing that trend is Charles Andrew Gardner, who plays Martin, and his past credits include Chicago PD, The Chi, and Olympia. I have only even heard of one of those, so it is going to be interesting to see a film with a cast of just so many fresh faces. And the next cast member, James McKinney, he's actually making his acting debut in this film, having been a director and producer prior to this. He did help produce Exodus, and he will be playing the character of Paul in this film. And another actor in Exodus/producer is Hannah Kleofner, who will be playing Michelle. And this next cast member may honestly be the most famous, even though he has really only had supporting roles in films. But those films include John Wick, Logan, and a role on the TV show Godless. He does seem to have a history of being typecast as a muscle-bound goon type character, but despite that, he may still have the most star power of any actor in this movie, so props to him. And while I may be ragging on the cast for them not being that well known or that well established, everyone's got to start somewhere, and this film Exodus really seems like it could be a launching pad for a lot of them in their careers. The cinematography looks great, the story sounds very complex, and even if a cast isn't that well established or oozing with star power, doesn't mean they're going to deliver bad performances. On the contrary, and I think I've discussed this in the past, having a bunch of fresh faces in a movie can make it feel more authentic and draw the audience in even more, get them really engaged in the story because they don't know this actor from anything else. When they're seeing them in the movie, they are the character they're portraying, as opposed to those actors who just play a movie version of themselves in everything they're in. Like how Jim Carrey is essentially just Jim Carrey from film to film. Or like how Vince Vaughn always plays a sarcastic jackass in his films. So personally, I think the fact that the cast of Exodus is really not that well known and isn't made up of a bunch of people with tremendous star power is going to make the audience invest even more in the characters and keep them entrenched in the story, which at the end of the day is the goal of any filmmaker and all the actors involved to deliver an authentic, believable performance. And for all of those interested in viewing Exodus, the film will be released March 19th and will be available via video on demand. Exodus is the story of a post-apocalyptic world where the main characters are in search of the door to paradise, which they have discovered thanks to a magical videotape. That may be my one qualm with the film. It's hard enough to find a VHS nowadays, let alone in some post-apocalyptic future. But in all seriousness, the film looks great. It's directed by Logan Stone and should be an enjoyable feature. But for right now on the GSMC Movie Podcast, we are going to be taking a little break, but don't go anywhere, because coming up, we'll be talking about the new film, The Vault, the new heist film that centers around a group of bank robbers that are obsessed with cracking the vault in the Bank of Spain. You'll definitely want to stick around to hear about that one, and be sure to stick around till the end of the show, where I take a look at who the best directors are working today. And at the time of recording this segment, I'm not sure if that's going to be a free-flowing conversation where I just touch on a lot of talented directors, or like most content on the internet today, it will be a top 10 list, so you'll have to stick around to even find out what format it'll be in. So don't go anywhere, and we will be right back on the GSMC Movie Podcast.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Welcome back into the GSMC Movie Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I'm your host, Rich McDonough, and I just finished talking about the film Exodus, which is set to be released March 19th, and tells the tale of a protagonist living in a post-apocalyptic society, but he has to find the door to quote-unquote paradise, which he's discovered through a VHS tape. So the film Exodus has a lot of crazy components going for it, but that is what makes films interesting, and the director Logan Stone says that the overall message of the film is that no matter how much you have going against you, which is represented by the post-apocalyptic society, it is still important to set goals and ultimately pursue your goals, which is represented by the door to paradise. So for those interested, the film Exodus will be available via video on demand starting March 19th. And as we shift gears into our next film, there is a bit of a similar message of setting goals for yourself and ultimately pursuing them. The next film I want to talk about is the heist film Vault, or The Vault, which is set for release Friday, March 26th, and it will be playing in select theaters as well as available via video on demand. And to reference what I was talking about earlier in terms of setting goals for yourself, this is a film about a group of bank robbers that have the goal of robbing the most secure safe in the world. And that would be the safe in the Bank of Spain, which apparently is one of the most secure in the world because there's so few blueprints on the architectural design of the bank, and there's not much information about the inner vault itself. So there's not too much hidden meaning in this film. It's just a good old-fashioned heist film. And right off the bat, I have to say that the cast is tremendous. Liam Cunningham stars as the one pretty much organizing the group and bringing them together. People will know him from his role of Davos in the HBO series Game of Thrones, where he played that role to perfection. And it will be exciting to see him in this new environment. Famke Janssen is in the film as well, and most people will remember her from her turn as Jean Grey in the original X-Men films. And while there were a lot of things wrong with those movies, her performance was not one of them. Also in the film is Freddie Highmore, who has been acting all the way back to roles in Finding Neverland with Johnny Depp and Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory with Johnny Depp. But he's probably best known for his role as Norman Bates in the series Bates Motel. And he will be playing the main character in this film, which is an engineer by the name of Thom. Another cast member is Astrid Burgess Frisbee, who was in Pirates of the Caribbean on Stranger Tides, so a lot of people in this film have also starred in movies featuring Johnny Depp. And rounding out the main cast is Sam Riley, who has starred in films such as Maleficent, as well as being the lead in the movie On the Road. And it is a good thing that there's a good cast in this film, given that heist movies traditionally are built on character interaction, and ultimately the action-packed conclusion where they pull off the job. And I think heist movies are very unique in the fact that they can have a pretty set formula to them, but audiences don't get sick of them because the formula just flat out works. With movies like the Ocean's franchise and Mission Impossible just making ridiculous amounts of money off of just a pretty basic formula. And it's pretty amazing that audiences haven't grown tired of this formula, but it is a pretty basic one. I found an article that basically outlines the simplest story structure that pretty much all heist films have in common. And they all seem to start with the mastermind. And this is the person that comes up with the job, identifies the players involved, and basically gets the mission started, which leads us into the next step when it comes to structuring a heist film, and that is the team. You have to assemble a team, everyone with a pronounced role, with a specialty that they're bringing to the table. Whether this be the person that's the getaway driver, or the one that takes care of the security cameras, assembling the team is a staple in any heist movie. And I'll get to the other steps that are pretty much essential for any heist movie, but it just makes me think of those films that go against the grain. And I'm thinking of the movie The Town, where it really just starts off with a heist. The team's already assembled. You don't know any of their backstory. You just know that they're here to rob banks. And I'm a real big fan of movies that do that when there are just so many different conventions that have been played out so many different times, and they're willing to play with subversion and go against the grain and try something completely different. It really makes for interesting storytelling, but that's not to say that this formula that has worked for multiple heist films over decades is not without merit. But on to the next step in this whole equation. We have the mastermind. He's assembled the team. The next important point when it comes to making a heist film is you have to understand the motivation, and there needs to be a clear reason as to why we're rooting for the people that are essentially committing a crime in the film. For the film The Vault, I kind of see the reason that the audience should be on the side of the team that is trying to rob the Bank of Spain is being positioned as the true underdog story. Everyone says that this vault can't be broken into, and this team is trying to defy those odds and do what people say can't be done. And I'm sure that it will be revealed that each individual team member has a motivation of doing what they're doing, given that the protagonist is an engineer and really has to be convinced to be a part of the team. So he must have something really driving him for him to consider throwing away a pretty lucrative career pursuit to attempt to break into a vault. So as with any movie, or really any story, motivation is key. But especially when it comes to heist films, because you have to give a compelling reason as to why you're risking spending the rest of your life in prison, and weighing that between how sweet the payoff is going to be if you succeed. So to recap so far, the components of a heist movie you need the mastermind to assemble a team and then motivate them into pulling a job, which the next step refers to as the headline grabber. And that simply means that the job has to have something, for lack of a better term, sexy about it. And in a film like Ocean's 11, it's pulling a heist on the 3 biggest casinos in Las Vegas, but in the film The Vault, it's breaking into a safe that is supposedly uncrackable in a bank that is said to be the most secure building in the world, that is across the street from the headquarters of the Spanish Army. And if a proposition like that isn't a headline grabber, I don't know what is. So we have the first 4 components that are a staple of any heist film covered. The next one is probably the most obvious one, and that is the plan. And this obviously is the team laying out how they're going to go about pulling off the heist. I personally don't have any insight into the plan of this movie. If you want to find out what the plan is, I guess you'll have to go see it. But as Mike Tyson once famously said, everyone has a plan till they get punched in the mouth. And when you're planning to break into the most secure building on the planet, as it's termed, you may run into a few hiccups. Which brings us to the next staple of any heist film, and that is the unpredictable element. And this is exactly what it sounds like, something that wasn't planned for and could have the whole operation blow up in their face. And this is supposed to be used as a storytelling device that's going to heighten the tension and ultimately make the story more intense. Which honestly is the main reason I think people enjoy heist films so much. There are clear stakes outlined, and the whole movie is just an exercise in tension. Will they get caught? Will they succeed? Whatever the result, you're emotionally invested in the story, and no matter how it turns out, it's going to be a compelling result. And it will be interesting to see what the unpredictable element is in the movie The Vault. But something else that I think gets audiences so invested in heist films is the next staple of this type of story structure is plausible losses, and that's the idea that at some point in the film there needs to be a sacrifice, whether it's a member of the team sacrificing themselves for the greater good. But heist films traditionally do take that idea of a happy ending where everyone makes it through and pretty much chucks it out the window, because they're dealing with high-stakes situations where if in real life there was a group robbing the Bank of Spain, it is fairly unlikely that any of them would make it out. But because The Vault is a movie, there is that natural suspension of disbelief. But nonetheless, if history is any guide, you can count on at some point during this film there to be a major sacrifice made for the good of the mission, which connects pretty directly to the next plot point that is fairly consistent in heist films, and that is the enemy gaining the upper hand. And I'm not suggesting by any means this is something unique to the heist film. It's pretty common throughout really any story structure. Really any protagonist has to experience some level of hopelessness in order to make their ultimate triumph that more satisfying. So while this may be a staple of the heist film, it's really a staple of any hero's journey. But when it comes to heist films, the next step is essential to them, and that is the final showstopper. After all the planning, after all the build-up, the time has finally come to put the plan into action. And in most heist movies, this concludes with the team pulling off the heist and making away with the loot. But you never know. There are definitely films where everything goes awry and no one gets a happy ending, such as Quentin Tarantino's Reservoir Dogs. And with directors concerned with subversion seemingly more than ever in today's day and age, who's to say how The Vault is going to end? And that really is the final component that is consistent with most heist films, and that is the happy ending? ? Do the main characters get away with this scot-free, or are they set to face some consequences off-screen? Or in films such as Inception, with the ending being left ambiguous, where you're not sure if the person succeeded, or if they're still stuck in the same life they had before pulling off the heist. But regardless of the individual storytelling choices that the filmmakers make, those are pretty much the basic components of a heist film. And for anyone who would be interested in reading the article that I was pulling this from, you can find it at industrialscripts.com/write a heist movie. Now it remains to be seen if the movie The Vault will be checking off all these boxes, but like I said earlier, heist films do tend to stick to a pretty consistent formula, and there's nothing wrong with that. If the formula works and the filmmakers deliver on the emotional beats, then that's all you can really ask for as an audience. And the premise of this film has a few cool layers to it, given that when they're attempting this bank heist, it's going to be during a time when Spain is attempting to qualify for the World Cup, and good old European soccer hooliganism is going to cause all the security and police forces in the city of Madrid to be focused elsewhere. So it's the perfect cover to attempt to break into the most secure bank on the planet. So whenever you're in trouble, you can always count on the good old soccer hooligans. I really don't get the level of fandom that Europeans have towards soccer, but to each his own. My own personal feelings about the sport of soccer aside, this will create a nice cover for the team as they attempt to break into the bank, as there will be a giant screen right near the bank displaying the game for the public, but this will also put them under a ticking clock, as they will pretty much only have until the game is over to accomplish their mission. So the movie The Vault seems compelling on many fronts, given that it has a terrific cast. The action in it appears to be great. A lot of this film was filmed on location in Madrid, so beautiful city background. And while I do joke about heist movies basically following the same formula pretty much to a T in each film, these movies build a lot of tension, and they're very compelling. When you're watching them, you inevitably find yourself rooting for or against the main characters, whether you want them to succeed or whether or not you want the justice system to prevail and the main characters to fall flat on their face.
So, for those of you listening who are interested in a heist film, be sure to check out The Vault. It will be debuting March 26th and will be playing in select theaters as well as available via video on demand. We are going to be taking a quick break here on the GSMC Movie Podcast, but be sure to stick around because coming up, we're going to be taking a look at who some of the best directors are working in the film industry currently. And this won't be a list of just people like Steven Spielberg, Ron Howard, Martin Scorsese, whose places are pretty much established at this point as some of the best directors of all time, really. I'm going to be taking a look at some fresher faces and a look at some up-and-coming directors that are already making a name for themselves and should have a lot more exciting projects in the years to come. So don't go anywhere. We'll be talking about the best directors working in Hollywood today on the GSMC Movie Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network.
Watching TV has changed over time. Streaming has become the new norm. That's why Golden State Media Concepts television podcast dives headfirst to the world of cord cutting. Want to be on the loop of what's hot in Netflix? Or if it's not a preference, what about original shows in Hulu? We've got you covered. Join us as we fill in the blank and talk about movies to stream and what show you should be binging. This is the Golden State Media Concepts television podcast.
GSMC Movie Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I'm your host, Rich McDonough, and I just finished talking about the film The Vault, set to hit theaters March 26th. This new heist film follows a team of bank robbers who are attempting to rob the Bank of Spain, pretty much because people say that it can't be robbed, and it appears they like a challenge. So if you are a fan of the heist genre, be sure to check it out, as it will be debuting in select theaters and will be available through video on demand. But switching gears to our next topic, I wanted to give my opinion on some of the best directors that are working in Hollywood today. And I did cover this a little bit in the tease of the previous segment, but people like Martin Scorsese, Quentin Tarantino, Steven Spielberg, they're not going to be a part of this segment because it's well established how great they are, and anything I had to say about directors like that would just be stating the obvious. I more so want to talk about directors that have really made their mark in the past 10 years, and while they have established themselves by doing great work, this is mostly going to be a conversation about directors who I believe their best work is still ahead of them. So, without further delay, let's get into it. And I want to start off with the person who I think is just the best director working today, and I believe that is Christopher Nolan. While he does have a rather long track record going all the way back to 2001 with Memento, his work is just flawless when it comes to a narrative standpoint. His characters' motivations make sense. His plots are incredibly complex, but are easily explained. And from a technical standpoint, he is one of the best filmmakers I think there's ever been. He is one of the last people that still holds out and uses actual film when making a movie. And he just has this way of bringing gravitas to every project he works on. And it's really hard to define what makes a movie perfect, because movies are subjective, but his film Inception may be a perfect movie in terms of getting the audience emotionally invested in the story, having the plot come full circle and have all loose ends tied up, and with the ending, the old adage of always leaving them wanting more. And with a director's main job being bringing a script or a story to life, he, I feel, does that better than anybody, of just making his films feel real. So for my money, the best director working in Hollywood today is without a doubt Christopher Nolan. And that's not to say he's perfect. His latest film, Tenet, did seem like it was really just an attempt to top himself when it comes to complex storytelling. But even when you can criticize a film like that, you can just take a look at the visual effects in that film and count that as an example of just how good of a technical storyteller he is. And it just boggles my mind that he has never won an Academy Award for Best Director. But the next director I want to talk about is the most recent recipient of that award, and that is Bong Joon-ho, having won Best Director for his film Parasite. And while he has been directing for a very long time in his native South Korea, American audiences are really only familiar with his work from Parasite and his previous film Snowpiercer. With Parasite, of course, garnering a lot of critical acclaim, having won him 3 Oscars for Best Director, Best Film, and Best Original Screenplay, whereas Snowpiercer was a bit of a sleeper hit. But it, of course, went on to be adapted into a TV series, which just gives you an idea of how big a fan base it had. And while he has been a director for over 20 years, with him only recently being introduced to American audiences and them responding to his work so positively, I think this is only the beginning for him, and I think American audiences and audiences around the world have yet to see his finest work, which is saying something given how crazy a film like Parasite is, where it goes from a story about socio-economical divide to a horror film, essentially into a crime drama. And if that's just a sign of things yet to come from Bong Joon-ho, he is going to stake a claim as one of the best directors of his generation. which is a pretty hotly contested category when there are people like Alejandro Gonzalez Inarritu, who, despite having only directed 6 films to date, has already become one of only 3 people to win back-to-back Academy Awards for Best Director for his work on the films Birdman and The Revenant. And accomplishing that feat puts him in rarefied air with the legendary John Ford and Joseph L. Mankiewicz, who is the brother of Herman J. Mankiewicz, who just had the film Mank made about his life. Those two must have had some pretty proud parents. But Inarritu's success came in years when the category of Best Director was very hotly contested. He beat out people like George Miller for Mad Max Fury Road, Adam McKay for The Big Short, Wes Anderson for The Grand Budapest Hotel. So it's not like he had an easy road to winning back-to-back Best Director awards, if there even is such a thing. But accomplishing that feat in and of itself should just speak to the level of talent that he has. And his next film, Limbo, is still in development and yet to be released, but if it's anything like his previous work, it should be another masterpiece. So simply because he is directing it, that's a film that I have on my watch list. So he is without a doubt one of the directors that is turning out great work and is worth keeping an eye on, and a relatively new director that is about to become much more prominent is Chloe Zhao. She seems to be lighting the world on fire, having just won a Golden Globe for Best Director of her film Nomadland, which also took home the Golden Globe Award for Best Motion Picture in the Drama category. She is nominated in both those categories in the upcoming Academy Awards, so it'll be interesting to see how she fares on that stage. But not only is she garnering critical acclaim, she is also going to be the director of the upcoming Marvel film The Eternals, which is set for release later in the year. And that is only going to be her 4th film that she has directed. So to date, she only has 3 films released, already has a Golden Globe for Best Director, has garnered a ton of Oscar nominations, and she's been handed the keys to a Marvel movie. Not bad considering she's only 38, which is relatively young for directing, which also means she has a long career ahead of her. So I definitely think Chloe Zhao is someone who is already proving that she is an immensely talented director and has a bright future ahead of her. And another director that doesn't have a whole lot of experience in terms of number of films that they've directed, but the quality of films that they have directed are through the roof, and that is Jordan Peele. A lot of people know him from his time on Mad TV and his own show Key and Peele. And you never know how it's going to turn out when an actor makes that transition to behind the camera. But he knocked it out of the park with his first film, Get Out, and his follow-up film, Us, only reaffirmed that he is a very talented director. And it's strange to see someone that has been in the comedy realm for their entire career make such a successful transition to the horror genre. And I personally hope he branches out and directs films in multiple different genres. I can only imagine the quality of a comedy movie directed by him, but he is very young in his directing career, so I'm sure there will be a lot more to see from Jordan Peele. And another director who I think is putting out tremendous work right now, but who has had a very successful career dating all the way back to 1999 is Sam Mendes, and the main reason I'm including him in this conversation is simply for his film 1917. I mean, just the sheer ambition in attempting to make a film appear as if it's one continuous shot is absolutely ridiculous. And the way they managed to pull it off is incredibly impressive. And not only that, the scene in 1917 where it's at night and one of the soldiers is running around trying to dodge all the explosions is one of the best shot scenes I think I've ever seen. Now, including Sam Mendes on this list is a bit of a cheat, given that he won Best Director for the first film he ever did back in 1999, which was American Beauty. But he's really done tremendous work in the last few years. He directed the last 2 James Bond films, Skyfall and Spectre. which a lot of people credit for injecting a much needed shot of adrenaline into the legendary franchise. So, I'm probably breaking my own rules by even including Sam Mendes on this list, but this is my podcast and I can do whatever I damn well please. And my god, 1917 was cool. But getting back to directors that have been making a name for themselves in recent years, one person who I think is slated for big things is Patty Jenkins. She was the director of Wonder Woman and its sequel, Wonder Woman 1984, and while the latter garnered mixed reviews from critics and audiences, she is a very talented director in a field that is often dominated by men. And she's not even someone I have to predict big things in her future. She already has them slated on her schedule. She's going to be directing a Star Wars film titled Rogue Squadron that is set for release in 2023. And she is also going to be directing a film about Cleopatra. So there are certain benchmarks you can pretty much say you've made it as a director, and I think that directing a Star Wars film is one of those. And another great director that also directed a Star Wars film despite the critical response it received is Rian Johnson. And when the Star Wars film you directed seems to be the low point on your resume, you could be in a worse spot. But besides directing Star Wars The Last Jedi, he has directed the Joseph Gordon-Levitt, Bruce Willis time thriller Looper, as well as Knives Out, which is already getting a sequel. And Knives Out in particular just speaks to how talented he is as a director. He was blessed to be working with an all-star cast from top to bottom, but just the way he was able to balance everyone's screen time, make sure all the star-studded actors in it got a chance to shine without detracting from the story and being able to move the narrative along was just expertly done, and I cannot wait to see the sequel to that movie. And the final director I'm going to be talking about on this podcast is actually a pair of directors, and that is the Russo brothers. Probably best known for their work in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, having directed Captain America and the Winter Soldier, Captain America Civil War, Avengers Infinity Wars, and Avengers Endgame, which up until recently was the highest grossing film of all time, but James Cameron felt the need to re-release Avatar into theaters, which I just find amazing given the fact that this man had the two highest grossing films of all time up until the release of Avengers Endgame, and he is still insecure about being knocked off the perch. Oh well, whatever helps James Cameron sleep at night. But back to the Russo brothers. Not only have they had immense blockbuster success with their work in the MCU, they've also come out with a film named Cherry, which I've talked about on the podcast, which is already garnering a ton of praise. So while I imagine having two directors on a project probably helps, and the fact that they're brothers, they just have that natural chemistry with each other, but that doesn't take away from the incredible feats they've been able to accomplish in the film industry. But there you have it, my thoughts on who are the best directors going today and who are consistently turning out the best work. And there are a lot of different components that go into making a film, and there's a lot of very important people that contribute to getting a film made, but I don't think any has a more vital role in making it a reality than the director. They are the ones with the vision in their head on what the film should be. They are the ones that are talking to the actors, telling them what emotions they should be invoking from scene to scene. They're the ones making all the technical decisions day of shooting when it comes to how the camera should be positioned, to sending the dailies to the editor with instructions on how they believe the film should be laid out from that point. It is easy to see why they're often referred to as the authors of the film. And they are very deserving of the title, given that they seem to have a hand in pretty much every aspect of the film when it comes to getting it made. And after viewing Zack Snyder's Justice League and seeing the difference there is when the director has control over the story being told, as opposed to studio executives trying to manufacture something, It really goes to show the importance of having a good director and one that really is in tune with the story that they're trying to tell. Because if not, you are pretty much just left with a feature-length commercial to sell toys to kids. And to date, the only movie I've seen successfully pull that off is the Lego Movie. But I need to be wrapping things up here on the GSMC Movie Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. And I do once again want to thank everybody who is listening to the show. And if you haven't already, be sure to subscribe so that you're always notified when a new episode is released. And if you could write us a review, those really help us a lot. And be sure to keep up with us on our Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram pages. Once again, I've been your host, Rich McDonough, and thanks again for listening. That's all the time we have on this episode, and I will see you next time.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Movie Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. From movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.